Today I'm going to show you how to create this procedural iron metal texture. This is basically two textures, the regular version on the left and the displaced version on the right. It's not too complicated. This is what our end node setup is eventually going to look like. But if you want to just buy it, I'll make it available on my Gumroad and my Patreon. Before we start, let's just briefly talk about iron. According to the internet, it's the most widely used of all metals because of its availability, low cost, and high strength. It's a silver gray, lustrous material, so it's shiny. It's ductile, meaning it can be made into wire, and it's malleable, meaning it can be reshaped without breaking. It also rusts in damp air, but not in dry air, so we're also going to try and create a little bit of rust texture on there. So first thing we want to do actually is not delete the cube, let's duplicate it with Shift D, and then I'm going to hit X to move it along the X axis, and if I hold down Control, I can just kind of snap it to the grid there. Let's take this first cube, and I'll go SZ.1, and it just sizes it along the Z axis, and our dimension should look like this, 2.2. Hit N to get rid of that shelf or bring it up, and I'm going to come over here to the modifier panel and add a bevel modifier. You can see that it looks a little weird. The reason is because I didn't apply the transformation on this first cube yet. So I'm going to hit Control A and hit Scale, and now our bevel is working as intended. I'm going to change the amount to 0.04 and the segments to 3, and then hit W or right click to bring up this context menu and shade smooth. And that first cube is set up. For this second cube, let's come over here to the modifiers panel again. This time we're going to use a subdivision surface modifier and turn it up to 4. If we hit Control A, that'll apply the modifier. We can see it's now got all these extra subdivisions. It's not quite a perfect sphere, so I'll do one more quick thing, and that's add a cast modifier and change this factor to 1. It just modifies it slightly there. I hit Control A and then hit W or right click, bring up the context menu and shade smooth. And now these are both set up for us. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and grab this light. Just delete that because I'm going to bring in some HDRI lighting. Come over here to the world properties and click this yellow circle beside color and just click on environment texture. If you hit open, it'll open up your browser here, and you just need to find where you stage some HDRIs. If you don't have any, check out hdrihaven.com. There's a bunch of free ones there. It's just a really easy way to set up great lighting with very few steps. I'm going to use Kaylee Interior 4K. You don't need to use 4K. I just don't have 2K downloaded, so I'm going to go ahead and load this in. And now if I go into rendered mode, you can see that this scene is all around us. It's kind of lighting our object. You could uncheck the viewport display. Oh no, I'm on EV. We also want to go to cycles. Let's go to GPU. Then let's go back to the world properties there. You could uncheck ray visibility to the camera like this here, but I'm just going to add in a plane, move it down a little bit, and just scale it up. And then go into edit mode. Grab this back here. I just hit 2. In fact, I'm going to go into edit or rendered mode. I hit 2 to go into edge selection mode. Grabbed that guy there. I'm going to hit E to extrude and hit Z to go straight up. Grab this edge here. Hit Control B. We'll bevel it. And I'm going to use the mouse wheel to add, I don't know, something like this here. Tab out of edit mode. Hit W. Hit shade smooth. And now we got a little kind of, backdrop that's easy to look at, easy to use. Looks like my sphere is kind of poking through a little bit. I'm just going to move my backdrop down a tiny bit. It doesn't really matter how you set this up here. It's totally whatever your preference is. I'm just going to set a camera angle here. Zoom in a little bit here. And we can kind of see what we're setting up so far. Because we're primarily going to be working with the shader editor, let's change this whole middle area to our shader editor. Why don't we try this shortcut that I learned recently, where you got your mouse over here, hit Shift F3. And I found sometimes you have to do it a couple times because it kind of cycles between a couple options there. You can see like all 3 of these are all Shift F3. So eventually you get to the shader editor. Sometimes you get there first. I don't really know how it works, but Shift F3 is that shortcut. In the top right here, I'm going to go Shift F5, and that changes that to our 3D viewport. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so we can see it better. And we should have the same material on both of these guys here. Why don't we rename this Iron Metal? Okay, we're ready to get started on our texture here. And first thing I'm going to do is bring in a texture coordinate node. Place it right here. We're going to be coming out of object. And the reason is I just wanted this material to be something that can be used on a variety of different shapes, sizes, whatever. And so this just helps it be less constrained, as far as I know, anyways. So I'm going to bring in a noise texture, place it right after here, and then run this into a mix RGB. Move the noise texture over a little bit, and plug object into color 2. I'm going to set this scale at 0.6 and leave everything else the same. And this factor here, I'm going to set this at 0.9. If you look at what's happening, it's basically got a little bit of the noise texture influence, but not much. And the noise texture is quite large because the scale is so small. So, there's not much going on yet. Then I'm going to bring in a mapping node, place it right here, bring in a Musgrave node, place it right here, and then I'm going to bring in a color ramp and place it right there. I'm going to change a couple settings here. For the Musgrave, I'm going to set this at 6.5 for the scale. Should have just tabbed through that. 9.3 for the detail, and then for the dimension, we'll go 0.1. And for this color ramp, I'm going to set this white at a 0.8 position. I'll leave the black at 0. So we got this kind of cool, gritty texture that already looks pretty good. And I'm going to grab these 3 nodes, mapping, Musgrave, and color ramp, and I'm going to duplicate these while leaving them attached a couple times with Control-Shift-D. So once, twice, 3 times, and 4 times. I'll just move this over a little bit so it's easier to see. And you can make a reroute here if you want by holding down Shift and right-clicking and dragging through. I won't bother, but it's a good way to clean it up. So we're basically going to make small changes to each one of these little branches here and then add them all together at the end. So the top one, let's start with that. We're going to change the X scale to 0.5 and everything else will leave the same. We can see it's just kind of stretched it along this one axis here. This Musgrave node we will leave as is, but this color ramp, let's change this black value to kind of like a 0.4 gray there. So just come to hue saturation value to value. And just type in 0.4 there. You can also use the mouse wheel to scroll up and down. So we can see it's just made that black color a little bit lighter. And the reason I did that is because when I added these all together, if I had them all at black, it was just a little bit too dark. So having them at gray just helped lighten things up a little bit. It worked a lot better. For this second one here, we're going to add 0.2 to the Y and then multiply the X by 2. So let's look at this one while we're creating it. This is going to be kind of a different thing. It's more stretched along the Y-axis this time. And the Musgrave we'll just leave as is again. And the color ramp, we'll change this black level to 0.45 this time. So I'm just going to scroll up with my mouse wheel until that value is at 0.45. Onto the third branch here. Let's see what that one's doing. I'm going to start with the mapping node, and we will add 9 to the X here. For the Y, we'll add 0.4, and then we'll come down to the X scale and just go 0.2. And this is kind of stretched quite a bit along that X axis. Then this Musgrave texture, we'll change this one. I think the rest of them are the same, but we'll change this one. The scale is going to be 1. So it's a much bigger texture. We'll come to the color ramp, change this bottom color to a 0.3 gray. Onto the fourth branch, let's take a look at that guy. On the mapping node, we will add 0.6 to the Y, and then we'll add 12 to the Z, and then we'll multiply this X by 4. And then come over here to the color ramp. We'll leave that Musgrave alone. Come to the color ramp, and we'll change this to 0.8. So it's a very light value this time. This isn't going to have as heavy of a contribution to the end texture. So that's okay. It's just how I've chosen to do it. And on to the last one here. Let's take a look at that guy. And the mapping node, we were going to add 8 to the X, 0.7 to the Y, and then we'll come down to the X, and for the scale, we'll just change this to 6.8. We'll leave that Musgrave alone, and for the color ramp, we'll change this to a 0.6 value for the gray. So you can see I've already made a bunch of creative choices there. Now I'm going to start mixing these together. And the way I'm going to do that is Control-Shift, hold those down, right-click and drag from one node to the other, just these color ramps here. Open this up, change it to multiply, and change this to 1. So now you can see both of these have been added together. So you can keep doing this. Just drag from these two here. We'll open this up, change it to multiply, and drag it across to 1. Do it again. open this up, multiply 1 and one more time. Open it up, multiply, change it to 1. So we can see it's given us this kind of gritty, gray, black texture. And obviously you can change a bunch of stuff in this area here, and your outcome will be completely different. But this gives me a very versatile map that I can use for several different things. So I'm going to start by lightening this up. I'm going to bring in a color ramp and just put it right after here. Let's move this material output over a little bit, and maybe just move these together a bit and rotate them. Make it a little easier to see what's going on, but not take up too much room. And yeah, I don't know. This color ramp here, what we'll do is we'll leave the black at the bottom. We'll bring the white way down to 0.15. So this is a bit lighter now, a bit more range. This color ramp is going to feed into 4 other color ramps. So I'll just set this up really quick. Just put one there and Control-Shift-D 3 times. So we've got 4 color ramps here. This top one's going to be our color. The second one is going to be our metallic. This is going to be our roughness. And this is going to be our bump. So let's grab that principled BSDF that we had at the beginning. We'll just place that right here, and I'll just plug that in. We can see we already get something kind of interesting when we just plug this right into the color. I'm going to plug this into the metalness. This is going to go into the roughness. And let's bring in a bump node, place it here, run this into the height. We'll run this into the normal. I'm going to turn this strength down to 0.5. For the bump map, let's move this black up to 0.64, and then let's change this to kind of a 0.55 gray. I thought it looked pretty good. Whoops, I just changed that around accidentally with my mouse wheel. Just scroll up till it's 0.55. And this color ramp here, we're going to do something kind of similar. We're going to move the position to 0.64. We'll change it to a 0.5 gray this time. So that's the roughness and the bump. Then for this metallic here, I found it worked pretty well if you had these pretty close to each other. The white on the bottom and the black on the top. So the white, I'm going to set this to 0.4, and the black, I'm going to set this to 0.41. So they're pretty much right beside each other. So if you look at this here, the metalness, white is 1. So everywhere it's white, that's going to be a metal texture, and the black is going to be 0, so it's going to be non-metal. And the reason I put them so close together is you don't want a lot of gray areas in your metal map. Usually you want white or black and very little in between. Now let's tackle the top color ramp, which is going to be our color. I'm going to split my screen here and change this to my image editor. I've got this metal folder that I downloaded some reference images from Google there. I've got iron right here. I'm going to drag it in there, move this out of the way. And if we zoom in on our color ramp, hover over this area and hit E, it brings up this eyedropper tool. Now I can drag this across my image. And you can do this as long as you want. It seems to only have 30 points here at maximum. So once it adds new ones, it just kind of deletes the old ones. But do this as many times as you want until you get something you're happy with. This looks pretty good to me. And then what I'm going to do is I've also got this rust image here. I'm going to drag this in and basically just put it at the top few points here. Let's just change this top one to that color right there. Maybe let's do a darker one. Maybe something over here. That looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. So it's just giving me some rust areas here. And if you wanted to drag this down, you just get more rust in that image. You delete this guy here, drag it down a bit more. I guess you'd have to delete a couple of these. Let's do the one more here. Here we go. That looks pretty good. So I chose to make this top color the rust. You could also do it with like flaking paint or whatever. And if you want to change the normal map too, so that this is the other way, you can just invert this and it'll be, on the other side, if that makes sense. So we're all done our regular iron material, but I want to create some displaced iron as well. So I'm going to duplicate both of these here and just move them along the y-axis, so they're right beside. And I'm going to just change these materials here. Let's click on the sphere there first. Just create a new material there. And we'll call this iron metal displaced. And we'll come down here. Let's change it to iron metal displaced. But I'm going to create one more new one here because that one's going to be slightly different. We'll call this 2. So let's do this displacement. Before we do, we have to do one setting down here, the material properties. Let's change this, scroll down to settings, where it says bump only. Change that to displacement and bump. We'll just have to do the same for our sphere. So we'll work on the sphere first, but we'll basically copy these same settings over. I'm going to bring in a texture coordinate node. As far as I know, it doesn't really matter if you have a couple of these in here. I hope that's true. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just easier than running a line all the way from the beginning sometimes. So let's bring in a noise texture, place it right here, and duplicate that with Control-Shift-D so it remains attached to that object output. We'll change the top one. The scale will be 1, and the detail will be 6. I guess actually both of these will be the same, 1 and 6. I think I just kept them separate because I wanted to be able to modify them without changing both of them at once. So then I'm going to bring in a color ramp. Oops, not a, scroll in here a little bit. Bring in a color ramp, place it right here, and Control-Shift-D, that one as well. So it remains attached to that first noise texture. And I'm going to duplicate that one more time and just plug this other noise into this color ramp. Let's set the top one. The black will come up to 0.48 and the white is going to come down to 0.52. And if we look at that, that's our separation mask between the rust and the metal texture. And then this one right here, let's take a look at this guy. The black will bring that up to 0.48, and the white will bring that down to 0.5. What we're going to do is we're going to change these values a little bit. This black is going to be set at 0.8 gray, so pretty much white. And this white, we're going to bring this down a little bit to 0.98. And I'll explain what that does in just a second here. I don't know why I haven't made this screen smaller. I'm going to use this rust in a second, so I won't close it completely. But I'll just give myself a bit more room there. Then I'm going to bring in a mix RGB, place it right here, and this is actually going to run into the factor. And this bottom one is going to run into color 1. And just make sure this is still set at 0.735 gray. That's just kind of what it is as a default. Then we'll bring in a displacement. We'll put it right here. Make sure you actually plug this into the height, as it kind of just plugs into the normal as a default. We'll leave the mid-level at 0.5. We'll change the scale to 2. Bring this material output down a little bit here. We'll plug this into the displacement, and we can see it's displaced our mesh. Let's quickly talk about this color ramp here and what it's doing. This first one here, the 0.8 gray, if we turn this down, it creates more of an exaggerated displacement in those areas. And the reason I didn't change this to pure white is if I did, all this outer stuff would be flat. But if I had it at 0.98, you can see it's got this really slight bump all over this area here, which is the displacement working very softly. I thought it gave a really cool effect. I'm going to duplicate this principled BSDF, move it up here, and we're going to mix these two together. And this right here, this color ramp is going to be the factor between these mixes here. So we can see the inner areas where the rust is supposed to be. Those are going to be this top color ramp here. We'll set that up in a second. And then all those other areas, that's where the metal texture, the iron metal is. So what we'll do is, why don't we just run this object here? I'll just make sure that's coming out of object. Shift, right click, drag through to create those reroute points. And we'll just work this over. So it's going to come over to where this principled BSDF is. I'm going to add in a noise texture right here. Move this over a little bit. And then we'll bring in a color ramp. Place it right here. And we'll just duplicate this once. This top one's going to be the color. And this bottom one is going to be a little bump for us. Just place that here. Run it into the height. We'll change this to 0.2. Then we'll run this into the normal. This top one will run right into the base color. But let's actually bring in a hue saturation value node right there. It doesn't do anything as a default, but it does if we want to adjust some stuff. And I'm actually going to duplicate that and just bring it down to the bottom too, if we want to change that around. This noise texture here, I'm going to set this at 150, and I'll just leave the detail as is. But if we zoom in here, we can see it's just got these little spots there. We could bring up this color ramp if we want, and increase the bump in certain areas. Something like this. That actually looks pretty good. Why don't we do that? So we'll go to 0.6. And then for this color ramp up here, we'll do the same trick we did before. Let's make this window a bit bigger. Hover over this, hit E, and just drag it across. Let's make sure we can see what the effect is while we're doing that. So just do that as many times as you want until you're happy with the effect. I think this looks pretty good. I am going to make it a little darker though, and I'm going to do that by adjusting this value right here. So if we drag this down to like 0.4, 0.2, somewhere in that range, might look a little bit better. That's what I found anyways. And if we look at the final product here, we can see this is our displaced metal texture. I'm going to do something similar with this down here. Let's just grab all these, hit Control C. We'll just copy them in here. And we'll just plug this. I accidentally copied the material output. Don't want to do that. But let's duplicate this guy here. Not that guy. The principled BSDF. And just copy this quick setup here. We'll just put that in there. And loop those up there. Just make a little reroute here. And the last thing, make a mix shader and just plug this into the factor. And there we go. If you wanted to add maybe a subdivision surface modifier onto either of these, you could. I would recommend getting rid of this bevel, unless you want to change it around. But it's not really that useful anymore. One last thing I'm going to do is just increase the roughness on both of these here for that rust, because that rust really isn't going to be shiny at all. So there you go. Let's try this out too. If you wanted, you could just bring a plane in. Let's say you don't want like a cube or anything similar. Let's just look at that guy. If we add a subdivision surface modifier, let's go to simple. Let's bump it up to like 4 and bring in iron displaced 2 or 1. It doesn't really matter. Actually, for iron displaced 2, I found, let's just talk about this really briefly. Go back to this guy. I found that it looked a little weird when the displacement was set too high. I brought this down to 1, but it doesn't look too bad right now. And maybe that's because I don't have another subdivision surface on here. Yeah, that looks better anyways. Let's turn this up so it's got some more displacement going on there. We could do the same thing with our cube there as well. Let's bring it over here. Zoom in on this guy. And yeah, we can see it's displacing a little bit there. If we wanted to change the displacement, obviously, just bump this up. It's going to be too much if we go, to too high of a number, but we could always increase this as well. Let's try like 3. Too high. 2. Yeah, that's still a little too high. I just modified something here with the displacement. I found it worked a little bit better if you have these both coming out of the factor. I'll just show you where this is in my setup. It's just at the bottom here. I had it before where this top one was coming out of the color, and now the top one is coming out of the factor. And now all the rust is going in. So I'll show you the same thing here with the sphere. I'm just going to change it to the factor for both of these guys here. Now we can see the outer edges are a little bit smoother. All the rust is going into the sphere. And for this one here, my final render had it at a level 6 subdivision surface there as well. Let's do the same thing here. I guess it's already turned up to 6, but that looks much more like my original now. Let's quickly examine a few ways that we might change this around. If we wanted more rust, let's zoom in on our texture here. We could change this map right here. That's probably way too much rust. But if we wanted less rust, maybe bring it down here and make sure these are fairly close together. When you do, you'll have a bit better result. You could also change any of these maps here. And this map actually affects it quite a lot. Like let's say you wanted less surface imperfections. You just want to drag these over to the right. If you go too far, it'll be pretty clean. So, just be aware of what that look is going to give you. And lastly, if you come over here to all of these individual strands, I don't know what to call them, but they all have their effects. And if you wanted more effect, just come over here to the color ramp and turn this down. And this texture will affect your color more at the end. Turn it up if you want it to be less effective. And you can also change the shape right here with all this stuff too. So that's it. Hope you're able to see what I was doing, and you can figure out how you could change it around. I had a lot of fun making this procedural metal shader, and I plan to do more things in the future with it. If you don't want to set this up yourself, I will put it on sale on Gumroad, and I'll put it on my Patreon as well. Thanks a lot for watching.